Hi, I'm Josh here at the Journey Church, and we're making our way through Romans Disarmed in order to liberate Paul's letter and our communities in the face of structural oppression. Chapter 6 is economic justice and the kingdom of life. The prophets are always clear that the destruction of creation, as discussed in the last videos, is always a result of economic practices based on contrary idols and ideologies. These likewise oppress people. The overwhelming majority of people in the Roman Empire lived in poverty below the level of subsistence. So we know that many in the church would have been seriously poor, but it gets worse. Christians, in a sense, were disenfranchising themselves by separating their way of life and their lordship allegiance away from that of the empire towards this Jewish messianic sect, which many thought was strange, if you can believe it, and would have had consequences for them when trying to connect with neighbours, clients, patrons, and business associates. In a society where much depended on claims to honour, Jesus' followers were sacrificing this with real material consequences. It's in this light that we should understand the utmost importance of hospitality and creating a home for all in the church. For us, gathering around the table is unparalleled for building community in a welcoming environment. That's so important and was in the first century too. But for many early believers, they weren't just in church community for spiritual nourishment. This was a family on which they truly depended. For Jews living under the yoke of empire tyranny, receiving the story of Jesus' resurrection meant salvation. But this, again, wasn't just spiritual. For them, there would have been no dualism between spirituality and economics, or between salvation and politics. And we rob Paul and the Bible of its power if we impose that onto the text. In the resurrection, there is a restoration of justice. It condemns a kingdom of death and celebrates and inaugurates a kingdom of life. We have covered how our present systems of production depend on destruction and death. In chapter 1, verses 29 and 31, Paul lists 21 behaviours which he describes as manifestations of a base mind and improper conduct. Descriptions of injustice perpetrated by people who do not acknowledge God. And these overwhelmingly major on economic injustice. This is exactly the sort of list that has been robbed of its imperialist critique, as if it were just discussing individual sins unrelated to socioeconomic oppression. The authors are illustrating that the sweep of Paul's arguments cannot, or at least should not, be so reduced. In fact, the so-called attack on homosexuality in the previous verses has often drowned out acknowledgement of what is a withering critique of empire economics. The sort of thing that has been done over the whole letter to the Romans. The famous and important insight that Paul gives that the righteous live by their faith is taken from Habakkuk 4:2. The very next line of Habakkuk is, "Moreover, wealth is treacherous." For Paul, as with the prophets, covenantal faithfulness with God and people is reflected in the way we hear, engage with, and respond to the cries of those who are made to be poor, dispossessed, and vulnerabilised by structural violence. Inequality in the Roman Empire, as today, was created through debt. Paul is calling for a community founded not upon debt coercion, but upon love. Owe no one anything, he writes, except to love one another. He doesn't mean with your Sunday morning community, you give the biscuits and juice out for free. Paul doesn't want a minority profiting off the exploitation of the majority. That's the empire. This is about trying to turn more and more of life over to an economy of love, grace, and collaboration. Remarkably, Paul's letters are the first in known Jewish literature to cite Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbour as yourself. We quote this a lot, but all empire ideology is rejected in these words.